during the war? Because you jumped.
Okay, that's a fair question, and I'll answer it.
I mean,
You
I'm
can
not
answer
trying
it.
to change your agenda, but it's like,
Okay, that's fine.
It's a very long story.
We were both sent to Pearl Harbor to Nimitz's headquarters, Pacific Fleet headquarters. And we were there not too long before each of us was sent out on different operations. In the Aleutians, first of all, then the Central Pacific.
Yes. The first I was sent out on was the Attu campaign. Attu was an island in the North Pacific, one of the Aleutian Islands. It was a terrible place. In fact, most of the Americans involved in the Attu campaign thought, if the Japanese want this island, give it to them. it was indescribable. It was heavy fog all the time. One day the fog lifted for about 10 minutes or so, and I realized that I was living at the foot of a mountain. I'd never seen it before. But it was cold and miserable. In fact, it was so cold and miserable that not even germs thrived in Attu. Nobody ever caught a cold. Nobody ever got sick. It's really the worst place in the world. But that's where I first saw action, shall we say, and it was extremely important for the Japanese. This is the first real defeat that they had had. We took the island of Attu, and it was the climax was what the Japanese called Yokusai. It was what the Americans called the final banzai charge. The Japanese, all the survivors, made a charge, and they were all killed. If they didn't get killed by American fire, they pressed a hand grenade to their chest and exploded themselves. It was a horrible thing. And it was remembered by the Japanese as something that should be emulated. That other islands, they should do the same things. And it was, and there were many, many people who died as a result of this policy, which was inconceivable to an American.
I recently read Hagakure by Yamamoto.
Sorry?
I recently read Hagakure by Yamamoto Tsunotomo.
Yes.
The samurai text from, I believe, 16th century. And of course it has a lot of discussion about seppuku,
Yeah.
ritual suicide, and how that sort of self-sacrifice is to be emulated. Obviously, that's very different from my personal philosophy. I think a lot of our philosophies. What do you think is the ideological difference there? What is that separation? What is that bridge in understanding? How can a man strap a hand grenade to his chest? And how is that to be emulated as self-sacrifice?
Well, I can answer you in a rather devious way. The first American hero of the Pacific War was a Navy flyer called Colin Kelly. And what he did, according to a legend, was to dive his plane into the smokestack of a Japanese battleship and sink it. As a matter of fact, it turned out later that he didn't do that. That this was an invented story by the Americans to give a slight cheerfulness to a series of disasters, different places in the Pacific area that were being captured by the Japanese. But this story was given great prominence, and President Roosevelt immediately said that the infant son of Colin Kelly would be admitted to West Point as soon as he became of age. It was a fable. Well, I learned this when I arrived in Pearl Harbor because I was told that this battleship was still afloat, that it hadn't been sunk at all. But it was the idea of self-sacrifice of extreme nature was not foreign to Americans. Americans were capable of doing it. As far as the Japanese were concerned, they had been brainwashed for about 40 or 50 years into thinking that Japanese had never become prisoners in all of Japanese history, that it never happened. While I was in Hawaii, I had occasion to go to a prisoner of war camp there, and there were the prisoners there were very despondent, thinking that they had done something terrible, that had become prisoners, and they would never be able to return to Japan. I went to the library of the University of Hawaii and found what I was looking for, which was accounts of the Russo-Japanese War, and it showed quite clearly that Japanese, including officers, had become prisoners, and that there was no disgrace attached to it. I made copies of this and gave this to the prisoners to tell them that they were not the first who had become prisoners, but they had been brainwashed, that this propaganda had gone out, Japanese never become prisoners, Japanese never become prisoners, and finally people believe it. And so they think, well, if the worst thing we can do is to become prisoners, we should commit suicide. So I don't think it's something endemic. I don't think that it's something that the Americans couldn't do if they had to or wanted to. And I don't think it was because they were Japanese that they did commit suicide and en masse on had to.
Well, obviously, we have our own American jihadists who are prepared to sacrifice themselves. But that's more, that has clearly a religious connection. They're converted to Islam. But there were significant religious influences behind what you read in Hagakure. By the way, how did you happen to read it?
Just interest. I just picked it up.
It doesn't just happen to most
Picked it
people.
up.
Anyhow, but the main influences were the survival of medieval Japanese warrior mentality from the medieval period, and the very strong influence of Zen. Yamamoto Tsunetomo was a Zen monk. So the question is, were they persuaded that whatever happened, the most glorious thing to do was to charge ahead into enemy fire or even commit suicide?
Well, what's interesting is I believe that Tsunetomo was in kind of that nexus as it switched over to the Tokugawa era,
Yes.
where that sort of medieval mentality was changing. I believe that Yamamoto himself wanted to commit seppuku after the death of his master, but was forbidden to do so by the emperor because there was a changing policy of ethics. I don't know, I'm trying to connect modern ideas of nationalism, with its connection to history and its connection to the soil, with these older mentalities, these older ideologies, and how they've kind of rebirthed themselves in a modern context. Because Tsunetomo himself was part of an era that did not, or was no longer going to emulate this sort of ritual suicide in the same way. How do those, is that just a product of history? Do these ideologies just recycle? Or is there something more behind it?
Well, there is something more, a lot more behind it. And I don't know whether you want to get that far into the whole history of Japanese thought and all the influences that intervened at this point. But the simple answer to it is that even in the medieval period, there